3 million chickens, not in Iowa, not in Arkansas. In the middle of the Sahel on land the world once wrote off as dead. For decades, this strip of earth in northern Burkina Faso was a synonym for drought insurgency and empty villages. People drove through as fast as they could, windows rolled up, praying the engine wouldn't die. Today in that same dust stands something that looks impossible. A sea of metal roofs, cold storage units, humming long, low houses filled with the sound of birds and rows of solar panels drinking in the sun. 3 million chickens living and dying on a schedule that feeds a nation. The man who approved this gamble is Ibrahim Traoré, a young captain accused by some of being reckless and praised by others as the first leader in years to treat food as a matter of national security. The question in this video is simple, and it goes far beyond poultry. Why would a poor, landlocked country choose to build a gigantic chicken farm in the desert? And why has that decision quietly alarmed policymakers thousands of miles away? 2 years after Ibrahim Traoré took power, when most observers expected nothing more than speeches and shifting alliances, something physical began to rise in the north of Burkina Faso. On a patch of scrubland between the last farms and the first dunes, surveyors drove stakes into the ground. Cement trucks began to arrive on roads that had never seen heavy traffic. Villagers watched as lines were drawn that did not follow any old tribal or colonial boundary. They followed the sun. Engineers called the project an agro-security zone. On paper, it was simple, a cluster of industrial-scale poultry houses designed to hold up to 3 million birds per cycle, a feed mill, a hatchery, a slaughter and processing unit, and, at the heart of it all, a solar farm and deep wells to power and water the whole complex. On the ground, it felt like a small city appearing out of nowhere. The official story was straightforward. Burkina Faso imports a large share of its chicken, much of it frozen and shipped from overseas. Prices swing wildly with world markets. Poor families know the feeling of watching meat become a luxury overnight. A domestic megafarm the government said would stabilize supply, create thousands of jobs, and keep precious foreign currency inside the country. The numbers sounded impressive. At full capacity, the farm could supply enough chicken to cover most urban demand, with surplus ready to cross borders into neighboring states. 5,000 direct jobs were promised, along with tens of thousands of indirect jobs in transport, veterinary services, packaging, and feed production. But the real change was not only in the statistics. It was in the lives of people whose work had always depended on the weather. Take Adama, a 54-year-old herder who had spent his life walking behind cattle chasing shrinking patches of grass. Over the years, drought and conflict pushed him farther and farther from his birthplace. One bad season, he lost almost his entire herd. For a man like Adama, animals are not just wealth. They are memory, status, and a sense of self. When the project began hiring, Adama applied almost as a joke. He had never used a computer. He did not speak French well, but the managers were looking for people who understood animals, and they were willing to train. Today, instead of sleeping under the stars, Adama finishes his shift in a climate-controlled barn. He walks between rows of birds, checking feed lines, watching for signs of disease, and glancing at a simple control panel that tells him temperature, humidity, and water use. The stick he once used to guide cattle has been replaced by a badge that opens doors. He laughs when he says, "All my life, I chased grass across the horizon. Now the feed is in a silo and I push buttons." The farm brought similar changes for truck drivers, electricians, and young technicians from the capital, who suddenly found themselves assigned to a place their parents had warned them never to visit. On the surface, it looked like a bold but rational bet: turn empty land into productive land, replace imports with local production, and give restless young men a paycheck instead of a reason to join an armed group. But there was a risk hidden in plain sight. 3 million living creatures depend on electricity and water every hour of every day. A power cut of a few hours at the wrong time could mean catastrophic losses. A contaminated well could cripple the operation. A broken road could leave meat rotting in trucks under the desert sun. Who then would dare to stake a nation's food security and its political stability on such a fragile system in such a hostile environment? Right after this, we will look at why Traoré's government decided to accept that risk, and why some American and European analysts now quietly say, watch that chicken farm very closely. If you care about how food and power are tied together, Make sure you stay with this story and consider subscribing so you don't lose track of where it leads. On the surface, the Desert Chicken City is a story about agriculture. Behind closed doors in Ouagadougou, it is discussed in a very different language. For years, Burkina Faso's leaders lived with a simple and dangerous equation: foreign food plus foreign fuel equals foreign leverage. When a country depends on imported wheat, imported rice, imported meat, and the diesel to transport it all, it also depends on the goodwill of the banks, governments, and corporations that control those flows. If you are watching this from the United States, you've seen echoes of that dynamic in your own debates. Supply chain shocks, pandemic shortages, rising prices at the grocery store. You know that food is never just food. It is politics, anxiety, and security. For a landlocked Sahelian state, the stakes are even higher. Traore's circle understood that fragile states do not collapse only because of ideology or insurgency. They collapse when people are hungry, when soldiers are underfed, and when prices become so unpredictable that ordinary life feels impossible. In internal planning documents, advisors began to speak about protein sovereignty, not a slogan for a fitness brand, but a grim calculation. If the country could guarantee a minimum supply of affordable animal protein, it could buy time and legitimacy for deeper reforms. If it failed, no amount of rhetoric would save the government from anger in the streets. Why chickens? Because poultry offers speed. A calf takes years. A chicken takes weeks. With the right breed, feed, and conditions, the farm could ramp up and down relatively quickly, adjusting to shocks and crises. Why the desert? That decision puzzled many outsiders. The answer reveals the second layer of the project. Most fertile land in Burkina Faso is already contested by farmers, by local chiefs, by investors, and sometimes by armed groups. Building a megafarm in such areas would mean endless negotiations and accusations of land grabbing. It would also expose the project to sabotage by anyone who wanted to send a message. The desert offered something else: emptiness. No powerful families to displace, fewer local elites to appease, a wide open canvas on which the state could draw borders of its own choosing. There was also the sun. By combining poultry with solar energy and deep groundwater, planners believed they could create a zone that was, at least in theory, insulated from some external pressures. Diesel can be embargoed. Power plants can be targeted, but the sun shines and the wind blows regardless of sanctions. To reduce financial vulnerability, the project's backers structured the investment in a way that surprised international observers. Instead of one big foreign investor with a glossy logo, there was a patchwork: smaller regional funds, diaspora capital, and technical partnerships with engineers from Asia and the Middle East, who were willing to work quietly away from the spotlight. No single lender could dictate terms by threatening to pull out. Inside this maze of contracts, one idea kept coming up: dual use. If you strip away the technical language, dual use simply means infrastructure that serves both civilian and security functions. A road that carries food trucks and armored vehicles, a power line that keeps a hatchery running, and a radar station online. A cold storage unit that can store chicken today and critical supplies tomorrow. The agro-security zone in the desert was designed from its earliest sketches as dual use. In tranquil times, it would look like an ambitious agricultural complex. In a crisis, it could become a fortified hub, a secure food depot for the army, and nearby towns, a logistic node linking north and south, and a place where the state's presence could not easily be challenged. This was the deeper logic that most public announcements never mention. It answers part of our first question: why build such a vulnerable system in such an unforgiving place? Because in the minds of its architects, vulnerability cuts both ways. It forces the state to protect the zone with extraordinary care, and it also concentrates critical resources in a place the state can defend. But that explanation opens a darker question. If one chicken farm can serve as a food fortress in the desert, what will those who benefit from the old dependency model do? Will they tolerate a Sahelian country turning its empty land into a base for both calories and sovereignty? Or will they quietly look for ways to make this experiment fail? The first reactions came predictably from inside Burkina Faso. In the capital, government media celebrated the project as a leap towards self-reliance. Commentators used phrases like breaking the chains of hunger and reclaiming our desert. Officials toured the site, put on white lab coats, and posed beside boxes of chirping chicks. Among ordinary citizens, the mood was more mixed. Urban families, especially in poorer neighborhoods, watch prices closely. For them, chicken is not about ideology. It is the difference between a meal that feels festive and a meal that feels bare. When the first batches from the desert farm reached city markets, some households did notice modest price drops and more consistent availability. For those families, the numbers mattered more than the politics. A grandmother in Ouagadougou put it simply, "If my grandchildren can eat on a Sunday, let the politicians argue." Small farmers and traders, however, had reason to be uneasy. For generations, village producers raised chickens in low-tech, small-scale ways. Their birds were hardy, slow-growing, and deeply woven into local culture. Market women bought from many different households, negotiated all morning, and made their living on narrow, unpredictable margins. One of them is Fatou, a 49-year-old widow who has sold live chickens in a dusty market for most of her adult life. She remembers walking as a girl beside her mother carrying cages and listening to the gossip and laughter that filled the stalls. Before the desert farm, Fatou's days were chaotic but familiar. Some weeks she struggled to find enough healthy birds. Other weeks she had too many and prayed for customers. Prices jumped with disease outbreaks, feed costs, and rumors she could not verify. When the new project's distribution arm approached her market, things changed. Now on certain days, a truck arrives with uniform vaccinated birds at a fixed wholesale price. Fatou can buy as many or as few as she wants. Her risk is lower. Customers appreciate the cleaner, more predictable meat. But the margin she makes on each sale has shrunk. She puts it in words anyone over 50 can understand. "I am happy my children do not go to bed hungry. But if we end up selling only the state's chickens, will we still be free women or just another chain in someone else's system?" Across the region, ministers of agriculture in neighboring countries watched developments closely. Some quietly requested technical briefings, wondering whether similar zones could help their own food security. Others, especially those with powerful existing poultry industries or deep ties to foreign suppliers, warned that a wave of Sahelian megafarms could distort markets and undercut smaller producers. In distant capitals, the reaction was slower but sharper. Analysts at think tanks and multilateral institutions began to ask questions that had nothing to do with recipes or cooking oil. They noticed that the farm's location coincided with key security concerns, cross-border insurgent routes, areas of historic smuggling, and zones where the central state's authority had long been thin. They read with interest a line in a translated speech where Traore spoke of feeding our soldiers from our own soil with our own hands. To Western ears, that sounded at once reasonable and unsettling. Food in their frameworks was supposed to be a development issue, not part of a security doctrine. Within months, a familiar pattern emerged. Reports started to circulate raising alarms about animal welfare standards at the farm, the environmental impact on fragile desert ecosystems, and the risk that concentrating so many animals in one place could create new disease threats. These concerns were not entirely unfounded. Any large-scale farm carries such risks. But for observers who had watched similar industrial farms operate for decades in Europe, Latin America, and the United States with much less public hand-wringing, the sudden focus on this particular chicken project felt selective. Inside Burkina Faso, this outside criticism became part of the conversation. Supporters of the government argued that powerful interests were nervous. Opponents warned that the country was walking into an environmental trap and mortgaging its future water security for short-term political gains. In living rooms, cafes, and village gatherings, one question kept surfacing beneath the technical language. Is this enormous desert farm simply a tool to feed people? Or is it the first brick in a wall that will separate Burkina Faso from the economic and political control of others? That question had barely taken shape when something else appeared, not in a speech or a press release, but in a leaked document that would make the story of 3 million chickens much more complicated. The leak did not begin on television or in Parliament. It began, like many 21st century surprises, as a blurred image on a phone. A junior official took a photo of a map during a closed-door briefing. The image traveled from one encrypted chat to another, from one contact list to someone's cousin who worked as a driver, and eventually to a journalist with more curiosity than fear. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary planning map: road settlements, rivers, the outline of the desert edge. But certain points were marked in a bold color that usually belonged to a very different category of infrastructure. Most of the marks were familiar to anyone who followed security news in the Sahel. They were known military bases, forward operating posts, and logistics hubs, places where uniforms and weapons were expected. And then there was one more mark drawn in the exact same color with the exact same symbol, the 3 million chicken agro-security zone. If you've ever done serious planning work, you know that colors and symbols on official maps are not chosen by accident. They are part of a language, a code understood by people in the room. Whoever created this map had placed the desert farm inside the same conceptual box as airstrips and ammunition depots. The leaked image showed something else as well. Radiating from the farm were lines that did not match the public transportation grid. They linked the site not only to markets and cities, but to airfields, border posts, and secure compounds. Along those lines, small symbols suggested communications relays, fuel stores, and patrol routes. In other words, the chicken farm sat at the center of a network that looked very much like a military logistics system. When the photo began to circulate, reactions were immediate. Critics of the government seized on it as proof that Traore was building a militarized state under the cover of development. They feed the people, one opposition figure said, but only as long as the people stay inside their new map. Supporters countered that any serious government would of course protect critical food infrastructure, and that putting it on strategic maps was common sense, not conspiracy. For those watching from abroad, however, the leak confirmed an emerging suspicion. This was not just about chickens. It was about a young leadership trying to rewrite the country's relationship to land, food, and force. The most disturbing questions came from those who thought several moves ahead. If a chicken farm is treated as a strategic asset like a base, does that make it a legitimate target in a conflict? If hostile actors, whether insurgents or external powers, wanted to hurt the Burkinabe state without firing on civilians directly, would they go after this facility first? Or from another angle entirely? Was this map proof that Traoré was quietly constructing something the world had never seen before? A hybrid installation where the line between farm and fortress had been deliberately erased. The answers lay not in rumors, but in a set of contracts and legal designations that had received almost no public attention. And once those documents were read in the right way, the picture of 3 million chickens on a desolate plain would never look the same again. Buried in the mountain of paperwork behind any major project are a few lines that matter far more than the rest. In the case of the desert chicken city, those lines appeared not in the Ministry of Agriculture's files, but in the Ministry of Defense. The key phrase was critical infrastructure in support of national defense and civil resilience. In practice, this classification meant that the agro-security zone was legally treated not only as an economic asset, but as part of the country's security backbone. It required dedicated protection. It could be placed under military authority during emergencies, and damage to it would be prosecuted under laws designed for attacks on strategic installations. For planners, this was a logical extension of what we have already discussed. If food stability is a pillar of national survival, then the facilities that guarantee that food are in a very real sense part of the defense system. For many outside observers, especially in Western capitals, the symbolism was far more troubling. Think tank papers began to describe what they called the militarization of food systems in the Sahel. They warned that blurring the line between farms and bases could increase tensions, invite attacks, and undermine the neutrality of humanitarian actors. One expert put it starkly, when you paint a chicken house the same color as a barracks on your map, you should not be surprised if someone aims at it. To be fair, some of these concerns were grounded in genuine experience. Around the world, when food aid and security assets are tangled together, civilians can be put at risk. Humanitarian law becomes harder to apply. But inside Burkina Faso, another question was being asked. Why is it considered normal for wealthy nations to designate oil terminals, ports, pipelines, and even data centers as critical national security infrastructure, while a Sahelian state is criticized for doing something similar with a facility that feeds its people? The comparison is not perfect, but it is instructive. The United States maintains a strategic petroleum reserve for moments of crisis. Countries across Europe hold strategic grain stocks. Many NATO members treat cybersecurity assets as part of their core defense network. These policies are not framed as militarization so much as prudent planning. From that perspective, labeling a megafarm as critical infrastructure seems less like an authoritarian move and more like a recognition of the obvious. A hungry population is easier to destabilize than a fed one. Still, the leaked map and the legal designation gave ammunition to critics. Opponents inside and outside the country advanced a series of arguments. First, they claimed that placing food infrastructure under potential military control would politicize access. In their scenario, supporters of the regime would enjoy better supplies, while opponents could be punished through subtle deniable shortages. Second, they warned that by turning the farm into a symbol of sovereignty and resistance, the government was inviting external pressure. International lenders, they argued, could use environmental reviews, animal welfare standards, or debt negotiations to squeeze Burkina Faso until it adjusted its course. 30 some accused the leadership of using grand national security language to mask more mundane goals, patronage contracts for allies, and control over a lucrative supply chain. These are serious criticisms. It would be naive to pretend that power politics simply vanish when you build a chicken farm instead of a weapons factory. But supporters of the project responded with their own facts and logic. They pointed out that since the farm began operating, there had been fewer severe poultry shortages in urban markets despite ongoing regional instability. They noted that the project employed people from different regions and backgrounds, not just those loyal to the ruling circle. They showcased transparent pricing mechanisms designed to prevent a monopoly over distribution. Most importantly, they argued that in a world where food can be used as a weapon, through embargoes, speculation, or subtle manipulation of markets, refusing to protect domestic food production as a core strategic asset is itself irresponsible. For an American audience over 50, this may sound familiar. You have lived through oil shocks, trade wars, debates over outsourcing, and arguments about whether certain medications or technologies should be made at home or imported. You have seen how quickly talk of just business can turn into talk of national security when the stakes rise. Burkina Faso is in its own way wrestling with the same dilemma under harsher conditions and with far fewer resources. So where does this leave us? We have a giant desert farm that is by law and by planning part of a national defense strategy. We have critics who see danger in that merger and defenders who see it as long overdue realism. We have tangible benefits for some citizens and real risks that must be managed honestly. And we have one more question that reaches beyond Burkina Faso's borders. If this hybrid agro-defense model proves effective, will other Sahelian states copy it? If they do, how will the broader international system, from food multinationals to foreign militaries, respond to a region that is no longer content to be merely a buyer at the end of someone else's supply chain? To understand what this all means on a human scale, we have to leave the maps and documents for a moment and listen to the people whose daily lives now run on the pulse of this desert machine. One of them is Issa, a 38-year-old former soldier. For years, Issa served in a unit stationed near the northern border. He remembers long patrols with little sleep and even less food rations that arrived late or not at all, and the quiet humiliation of knowing that insurgent groups sometimes fed their fighters better than the state fed its own. When his term of service ended, he returned home to a small town with few prospects. Then came a recruitment drive for the agro-security zone. The project was looking for people who could handle responsibility, understand security, and work in harsh conditions. Issa signed up. Today he oversees a section of the farm's logistics, coordinating shipments of feed, supervising loading crews, and liaising with security teams who protect the perimeter. He jokes that he still wears boots and gives orders, but now the battle is against time, disease, and heat. When asked whether he feels the project is truly about food or just another form of control, Issa shrugs. Look, he says on the border, I saw what happens when the state is just a rumor. When there is no fuel, no medicine, no food, people do not care who is legitimate. They follow whoever can fill their stomach. If this farm helps us avoid that, I am willing to live with the fact that it is on a few military maps. In the villages closest to the farm, change is visible in other ways. Some homes now have a few hours of electricity in the evening, powered by surplus from the solar field. Children who used to study by candlelight can read a little longer. Women who once walked miles to fetch water now fill buckets from improved wells. Local clinics report small but significant improvements, fewer cases of severe child malnutrition, better attendance at vaccination days, and more mothers able to afford protein for their families at least once or twice a week. These gains are modest, not miraculous, but they are real enough to shift how people talk about the future. At the same time, environmental activists and independent scientists continue to raise important concerns. They warn that drawing heavily on deep aquifers could over time lower water tables and affect communities far beyond the immediate area. They worry about the concentration of animal waste and its impact on air and soil quality. They remind everyone that a disease outbreak in a dense poultry population could undermine both food security and public health. Their critiques are not easily dismissed as foreign interference. Many of them are Burkinabe committed to both sovereignty and stewardship. In response, the project's managers have begun to implement corrective measures. They invest in systems that convert waste into biogas and organic fertilizer, trying to close loops rather than leave open wounds in the landscape. They partner with researchers to monitor groundwater and adjust pumping rates. They experiment with integrating hardy local shrubs and trees around the farm to reduce erosion and create microclimates. None of this guarantees success, but it shows an awareness that sovereignty, if it is to be more than a slogan, must also mean responsibility to land and neighbors and to future generations. At the national level, the implications are becoming clearer. The desert farm has become a test case for a broader vision, a belt of agro-energy security zones stretching along vulnerable borders, each combining production with protection. In theory, this could turn regions once known only for smuggling and insurgency into corridors of employment and relative stability. At the regional level, neighboring states are watching. Some see opportunity for coordinated planning, shared standards, shared markets, even shared backup in times of crisis. Others fear a new imbalance with Burkina Faso gaining leverage as a net exporter of food in a hungry neighborhood. Globally, the story unsettles assumptions. For decades, much of Africa has been discussed as a climate victim, a place where desertification, conflict, and dependence on aid define the narrative. A 3 million chicken farm in the Sahel, wired into solar grids and defense plans, suggests something more complicated. A continent experimenting sometimes clumsily with ways to break patterns designed elsewhere. This leads us to an even larger question, one that reaches beyond maps, beyond poultry, and beyond any single government. If African nations begin to treat their deserts not as empty margins, but as spaces for strategic autonomy, combining food, energy, and security in new ways, how will the rest of the world respond? Will they welcome a more self-reliant Sahel as a stabilizing force? Or will they view every solar panel, every pipeline, every agro-defense project as a challenge to an order in which Africa's role was to supply raw materials and buy finished products? That tension is the backdrop for the final piece of our story. Not long ago, a brief note in an otherwise dull planning circular hinted at the next chapter. The government announced preliminary studies for 2 additional agro-security zones, one combining poultry and goats, another focused on drought-resistant crops and solar-powered cold storage. Both would be located near sensitive stretches of the border areas, long associated with trafficking and infiltration. On its own, that announcement might sound like simple expansion. In the context we have explored tonight, it feels more like a declaration. The desert in this vision is no longer a void. It is the front line of a new kind of sovereignty. For Burkina Faso, the meaning is immediate. If these projects work, they could anchor communities that would otherwise drift or flee. They could feed soldiers and civilians from shared sources. They could turn roads once traveled only by smugglers into arteries of legal trade. For the wider Sahel, they offer a template, imperfect, risky, but different from the scripts written in distant boardrooms and chancelleries. And for the world beyond, especially for viewers in America who have watched decades of policy experiments come and go, the question is unavoidable. What happens when African states stop asking primarily for aid and instead demand room to build their own hybrid infrastructures, messy, political, sometimes uncomfortable, that knit together food, energy, and force according to their own priorities? Do we respond with partnership, respect, and a willingness to see sovereignty as more than a word in a speech? Or do we respond with pressure, lectures, and subtle efforts to keep the old dependencies alive? 3 million chickens in a Sahelian desert will not by themselves decide the future of a continent, but they are a signal. They tell us that people who were expected to remain forever at the far end of the global table are looking for ways to cook in their own kitchens. The real story here is not about whether you prefer beef or poultry. It is about who decides whether a country eats, who pays the price when it cannot, and who benefits when dependency becomes permanent. If you want to follow where this experiment leads next, To the financing networks behind it, to the gold mines and trade routes that intersect with these farms, to the quiet negotiations in foreign capitals. I invite you to stay with this channel. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this story with someone who still thinks Africa is only a place of hunger and handouts. Africa bows to no one, and the sooner we understand that, the better prepared we will be for the world that is coming. Stay with us, we'll keep following Traore, the fight for real sovereignty, and the quiet battles the evening news will never show you. Disclaimer, this video is fictional storytelling created for education, commentary, and entertainment. It is not a factual report or official information. Any similarities to real events are coincidental. Please enjoy it as creative content only.